I'm got late. Happy Thanksgiving. This is chapter 14, January 21st, 2003. As the press worked feverishly to identify the woman from Fresno, police pressed forward. Detective Al Brokney again reviewed the tapes of the Martha Stewart living shows that aired in Modesto on December 23rd and 24th. Scott had told Brocchini that he took a shower on Christmas Eve morning, poured himself a bowl of cereal, and then joined Lacey that morning to watch her favorite show. Scott recalled that Martha was baking something using meringue. Brocchini wanted to see for himself at what time, if at all, Martha had referred to meringue. Having seen plenty of cases in which a suspect drew events from a previous day to create an alibi, he was eager to view the December 23rd show first. Sure enough, 40 minutes into the hour-long program, Martha and a guest, Bill Yasis, whipped up chocolate pastry layered in meringue. Brocchini replaced the cassette with Stewart's Christmas Eve broadcast. This time, Martha spent the first segment bacon lemon butter cookies. During the second half hour, prepared ciaupino, a kind of fish stew. The detective did not catch any mention of the meringue during the Christmas Eve show and stated as much in his report. Martha had, in fact, mentioned the meringue during the Christmas Eve show at 9:48 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. For Brocchini, the district attorney alike, this would prove an embarrassing oversight. Ironically, the discovery eventually led the prosecution to determine that Scott did not leave the house at 9:30 as he had claimed, but rather after 9:48, thus narrowing the time that Lacey disappeared. Detective Grogan was sitting in the Rocha's living room speaking with Sharon and Ron about the statement the family was preparing in response to the Inquirer article, when Scott Peterson's face popped up on the screen. Amazed, the group watched Scott's first television interview since his wife's disappearance. During the segment, the local station KTVU, Scott called the Modesto's B story about his alleged affair and a recent life insurance policy on Lacey a bunch of lies. However, Scott did not deny his involvement in Lacey's disappearance. That afternoon, Lacey's family members held a press conference. A tearful Sharon Rocha called on Scott to tell everything he knows. Her statement prompted a flurry of calls to Scott's cell phone, mostly from reporters looking for his response. Scott just erased the messages. Under Grogan's direction, search teams kept exploring the various bodies of water in the region. After probing nearby reservoirs, they were left with a list that included Delta Mendota Canal and San Luis Reservoir and O'Neill Forebay, and the San Francisco Bay. Police also searched the Squaw Leap Millerton Lake area, where Scott and Amber had picnicked with Ayanna in December. So in Native American culture, the word squaw is like the C word. So it's so funny to me when people name things that. Okay, so I got distracted and while dropping the C word on the internet. The rugged terrain and steep inclines led officers to conclude that it would have been too difficult to dispose of a body in Squaw Leap, but Millerton Lake was a more plausible locale, and they made a note to check in at a later time. Brocchini and Bueller toured the area with Amber. They were curious to see whether she would reveal any additional calls from Scott since the one in early January. But Amber didn't mention any recent unrecorded conversations, and the detectives never revealed that they had intercepted them. Her failure to report the calls had detectives concerned, and internal police reports indicate that they had not ruled her out as a suspect or accomplice in Lacey's disappearance. Although Amber Fry is taking steps to cooperate with authorities, she remains secretive with the previous conversations she had with Scott Peterson. Jacobson, the officer in charge of the wiretaps, wrote in a report. She informed us early on that she wanted to cooperate in this investigation, and even stated that she was tape recording her calls with Peterson, yet the evidence based on these intercepts had led us to believe that Amber Fry still has a desire to have Scott Peterson in her life, and that she may even lie or conspire with him to withhold evidence. Unsure of her allegiances, police scheduled Amber for a polygraph on January 21st. They also decided to examine her alibi closely. She had told the police that she worked with the client at American Body Works on the morning of December 23rd, and she had spent the rest of the day the following morning with her daughter. When the neighbors had stopped by her home around 2:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve and asked why she was still wearing pajamas, Amber's response was that she was off that day. Later that afternoon, Amber took her daughter to visit with her mother, and that evening she accompanied her friend Richard Beard, B-Y-R-D. Richard Beard, the Fresno police officer, to a holiday party. In the days that followed, police carefully investigated Amber's story and concluded that she wasn't involved in the suspected homicide. Still, they insisted that she take a polygraph. During this same period, Amber told police about a conversation she had had with Scott in early December. Scott told Amber that his friend Jeff was attempting to change his employment situation so he could travel less and have relationships with the girl he met. Bueller wrote, Scott said that he was concerned about the same thing. He was working too much, he told Amber, and wanted to do something about it. By the end of July, he promised he'd be able to spend more time with her. Scott asked Amber if she would trust in his abilities to make decisions, and if he contacted her regarding a big decision to possibly relocate, if she would trust his judgment. The detective continued. He told her he felt her style, along with her daughter, would fit in well with his life, and that they could explore this in more detail near the end of January, as things would settle down for him at that time. In a later phone conversation, Scott told Amber that Lacey's entire family believed that he had killed Lacey. Amber responded that his refusal to tell the truth about other things, such as their affair, had only hurt his case. He'd done nothing to prove his innocence, she told him. There's nothing I can do, Scott countered. Amber replied that he could start by cooperating with the authorities and that he should take the polygraph test. Scott insisted he'd been the only one telling the truth. You're lying again. Scott then agreed to take a polygraph on the condition that Amber accompany him. When she told him she'd meet him the following day, although Scott immediately backed off, telling her that he would take it in a few weeks. The wiretaps on the suspect's cell phones continued to offer insights into Scott's situation. According to the transcripts of one of the voicemails, Jackie Peterson offered some motherly advice. I wanted to talk to you about something, Jackie said. I would think that you should deny. I was told that years ago by an attorney, and I think you should talk to Kirk about it. I had to do that at the time. I'm sorry, but that's what I had to do, and I really feel that's what's right. That you must deny these things, not to the press, not to anybody, but to your family. because it will be talked about and it will leak, and it's not good if there's any truth to your unintelligible. I'm not saying there is. It is not known whether any attorney actually said that to Jackie Peterson, but an investigator, Stephen Jacobson, commented about this transcript. It appears by this message and by his own words that Scott Peterson is following these instructions. To Jacobson, the message also reflected badly on Jackie. I also believe by his mother not being specific and mentioning the affair alone, but by using the term deny anything, his mother and father know more about what really happened to Lacey. Jackie's instructions would never be played for the jury, but I discussed them several times on my program. While in public, Jackie always insisted on Scott's innocence. Behind the scenes, she was desperate to keep him quiet. From the second day of the investigation, Scott's parents were advising him not to take the polygraph. In the recorded conversations among the three, Lee and Jackie were never heard to encourage him to participate in press conferences, nor did they ever ask him if he had anything to do with Lacey's disappearance. To the contrary, the three were more likely to denigrate the cops or debate whether Scott was in good shape legally. Only when the Amber story broke did Jackie agree that it was time for Scott to make a media push. In hindsight, this seemed more for her than her son's benefit than it was for his missing wife. Scott didn't return his mother's call right away, but he did respond to the message left by Sharon. "Hello," Sharon said. "Hi, Mom, it's Scott. Where are you?" "Trying to get this volunteer center to happen in Los Angeles," her son-in-law told her. "Can't believe they canceled it." "What do you mean you can't believe they canceled it?" Sharon snapped. "Why can't we have it? We need to keep her picture out there and the volunteer center in Modesto," Scott replied. "When are you going to give up the charade, Scott? When are you going to call it quits and admit what you've done?" "When I find my wife and child," Scott responded flatly. "Well, you're the only one who knows where they are, so why don't you fill the rest of us in so that we can go get them?" "Mom, I didn't call you to," Scott said. "Well, that's the reason why I called you," Sharon retorted. "Oh, well," Scott said. "I want you to tell me where Lacey is," Sharon spoke over Scott. "I'm tired of your lies, I'm tired of your conniving, and I'm tired of your manipulation. You know damn well they're not opening a stipend center down there because you've embarrassed your family and everyone else. You shamed this world, Scott. You have had people out there looking for Lacey and somebody else when you've known all along where she's been. So tell me where she's at. I want her back." "I know you won't believe that I want her back also. That's all Oh, I'm sure you want her back too. You're brokenhearted," Sharon continued. "I know that, Scott. So now, just be honest with me and tell me where she is." I can't listen to you tell me. And I can't listen to your fucking lies anymore. Now get to the truth." The connection went dead. Sharon Moshe was already reeling from the news of her son-in-law's dual life when Detective Grogan learned that Modesto Mayor Carmen Sabatino had told reporters that the Modesto Police Department did not believe that Lacey's body would be found. He then declared that the searches were being discontinued. None of it was true, of course, and Grogan knew that the mayor's comments would be upsetting to Lacey's family. Anxious to set the record straight, the detective placed a call to the Rocha residence. When he didn't reach anyone,
I'm Chief Wallace with the
I'm at
Portland Police Department. Please help our police officers by being
when he didn't reach anyone,
unattended bags.
he paged Kim Peterson. Detective Bueller was at the headquarters when Kim phoned back. She told the investigators that she was at the Rocha's home and asked him to come and assist her. Grogan and Bueller arrived to find a house full of people. The detective spoke with Sharon and Kim in the back bedroom. Chief Wasden had already assured the Rochas that the mayor's announcement was incorrect, but Sharon had spent much of the day distraught over how Lacey may have died. I explained to Sharon that based on Detective Bueller's experience and mine, coupled with the opinion of Sharon Hagen, and evidence obtained during the search warrant, it did not appear that there was a violent or bloody crime scene in the home, Grogan wrote in his report. I told Sharon Rocha that it might be our opinion that Lacey likely died after she went to bed that night and may not have awakened or been aware of what had been occurring. Sharon's concern was that her daughter was placed in water alive, with cement attached to her based on the story she read in the National Enquirer. I told her it was a very unlikely scenario, Grogan noted. Sharon Rocha seemed to find some comfort in the release of information. Later that evening, in a brainstorming session, Bueller and Grogan drafted 2 lists, one cataloging reasons Scott may have elected to dump Lacey's body in freshwater, and the other noting reasons he might have chosen the San Francisco Bay. They hoped the exercise would help them determine where they should shift their focus and efforts. By night's end, the freshwater list was 10 entries long. The number of reasons Scott may have chosen the San Francisco Bay had reached 41. Among them was Peterson's statement to police that he was at the Berkeley Marina on Christmas Eve, the pay stub from the marina stamped with the time consistent of his statement, the cell phone records that showed Scott's location at the marina, the bloodhounds who tracked Lacey's scent to the marina, Scott's 2-day fishing license purchased December 20th for December 23rd and 24th, Scott's whistle on the wiretap on January 11th, as he listened to Sharon Rocha's voicemail that the object in the bay was an anchor and not a body. Peterson's trip to the marina since December 24th, Scott's research of the San Francisco Bay, including a map that showed how deep the currents were. Salt water in the boat, not freshwater. Scott's call home and leaves Lacey's messages as he's leaving the bay saying he's going to be late. Purchased just $13 gas in Livermore, not a significant amount for a truck, but enough to establish his whereabouts. Over the weekend, Scott reached out to Brett. He told his brother-in-law that he was still out of town and he wanted to let him know that the volunteer center in Los Angeles was poised to open. His statement was met with silence. After a few seconds, Brett asked Scott if he had ever read the definition of a sociopath. A sociopath, he explained, is someone with a mental illness who thinks that they can get away with things. It's you, Brett declared. I think you need to come clean. You're not going to get away with it. Scott laughed. Brett, I didn't do it, man. You messed up, man. Everything is leading to you. What did you do to my sister? I didn't do anything. Tell us where she is so we can get her back, Brett begged. Scott threatened to hang up, but Brett pressed on, accusing his brother-in-law of avoiding the family. He pointedly asked Scott why he wasn't cooperating with the investigation. I have, Scott said. So many things don't add up, Brett said. Why didn't you take a lie detector test? Scott told Brett he only telephoned to tell him about the center opening up. If you want to call me and accuse me of these things, I'll take your call. If you want to call me up to accuse me of these things, I'll take your calls. But hopefully you will find out these things aren't true. It's gone too far, Brett said, telling Scott it was time to clean it up. Scott maintained that he was following the advice of his attorney. Since when did you start talking to attorneys? Brett asked. You hire them because they know the right thing to do. If you love Lacey, you'd be out there looking for her, trying to get her back, not looking for some damn attorney that's going to try to get you off, Brett snapped. I hope you see by my actions that I'm trying to get her back. The media is against me. Dude's a fucking idiot. Poor Scott, the media's against him. Oh no. But Brett had had enough. He was no longer looking for Lacey, he said, because he believed that Scott Peterson did it. "That's a shame," Scott responded. "There will be people that will help me, and we will be working toward the same goal." In their analysis of Scott's sentiments, though the police agreed that Brett and Scott was just hiding behind his attorney, as Stephen Jacobson wrote, "Hiring a criminal defense attorney would perhaps be the last thing I would consider if my pregnant wife came up missing." He then set out the real reason that everything seemed to be going against Scott. Like the police, the media is suspicious of Scott Peterson because of his alibi and the amount of lies he tells. Scott has access to many other attorneys who are working out other matters with Lacey and her immediate family, will and probate. Why Scott hired a criminal defense attorney this early on in the investigation to defend him has and will remain interesting. Scott returned from his weekend in Southern California to find that his home had been burglarized. Dialing headquarters, he reported that he arrived at 7:45 p.m. on Sunday, January 19th, to find some clothing and other personal items that were missing. Although nothing of value was taken, some food and alcohol had also been consumed. Scott had not set the house alarm on because of the way he'd secured the front gate. He had received a call from Kim McGregor about an hour before he arrived home that evening, advising him that she'd just been to the house to feed Mackenzie. When she went into the backyard, she found the side door open. Nobody was home, so she closed it and left. The police later determined that the entry had occurred through an unlocked gate. A small window was broken in the rear dining room door, and one or more individuals had reached inside and unlocked the door and entered the house. Police found the scene inside curious. The thief or thieves had emptied a bottle of Jack Daniels and opened some Christmas presents, along with stealing some property. Police found that the empty whiskey bottle on the floor near the bar in the dining room, and according to Scott, it had been 1/3 full when he had left for Southern California. Several Christmas gifts were lying on the floor near the empty bottle, the wrapping paper ripped open. One of the gifts, a sweatshirt from Carmel intended for Ron Gratzky, was gone. Another was left unwrapped for the dining room table. On the dining room table, its colorful paper dumped in the kitchen garbage pail. Police noted that 2 of Scott's jackets had been taken from the coat rack near the door. It was clear that the suspect had spent some time in the couple's kitchen, drinking a Pepsi and eating a pear. Both items were left on the kitchen counter. Police found a used glass in the sink. A search of the bedrooms was inconclusive. Scott couldn't be sure if anything had been taken from the closets, but it appeared that all of Lacey's jewelry was still there. Later that week, Grogan learned that Scott's neighbor, Kim McGregor, had been identified as the person responsible for the burglary. Another neighbor on Covina, Amy Krigbaum, dialed 911 to report seeing a white female leaving the Peterson home with a handful of items around the time the burglary occurred. She told the police she saw the woman place the objects in the trunk of a white Honda and drive off. During the interview with McGregor at the headquarters, she confessed to the burglary and told the police she didn't know why she did it. Based on this, the police spent some time trying to identify or eliminate her as a suspect in Lacey's disappearance. They found no indication that she even knew the Petersons before Lacey vanished. After it was clear that McGregor was cooperating with the investigation, the police asked her to phone Scott and to speak with him about the burglary. During the conversation, Scott told her not to worry about what she had done. He then advised her not to tell anyone about it. The detectives asked that she call Scott right back and to tell him that she'd already gone to the police with her story. Scott said he had already known that, even though the confession had only just taken place, and then admonished her not to talk about it ever again. The police later reported that they found it interesting that Scott advised McGregor not to tell anyone. In one of the recorded calls with his sister, Scott referred to McGregor as a psycho girl. Maybe he expected such behavior from her. Then again, this may have been a hidden defense strategy to deflect attention from himself to an unknown, mysterious burglar who may have had something to do with Lacey's disappearance, Jacobson wrote. Perhaps Scott realized that her confession to the police she could not remain the mysterious burglar he had hoped, or he had conceded it could have been a simple act of leniency on Scott's part. When the police formally notified Scott of McGregor's involvement, he declined to press charges. However, a few days later, police recovered a video camera behind a store not far from the Petersons' house. It had been thrown into a 55-gallon drum used by a local restaurant to dump their grease. Inside the camera was a video of Lacey Peterson, including footage of her at the July 4th gathering that would later hold jurors spellbound as Lacey came to life in the courtroom. In the short term, however, the camera revealed to the police that Kim McGregor hadn't been truthful with them. They ordered her back to the headquarters for a second interview and warned her to come clean or else. Faced with the threat of prosecution, McGregor admitted to stealing the video camera and Lacey's Social Security card. She said she had taken the camera from the dining room and the Social Security card from Scott's dresser. She could not explain why, but admitted that she had awoke the following morning and realized what she had done, and decided to dispose of the evidence as quickly as she could. She had forgotten about the Social Security card, but later found it and turned it in to the police. McGregor told the police that she was fascinated by the case and wanted to learn more about Scott and Lacey. After leaving headquarters, the police wiretaps captured Kim, calling Scott again to alert him that Detective Brocchini had asked her to take a polygraph. Kim felt Brocchini was trying to use her to get information from him, and she didn't know what to do. Taking the polygraph shouldn't be a problem for you, Scott said. McGregor was scared and wanted to refuse the test. Scott said she could, but explained that the police will think something is up, and they start to looking at you harder. You might as well do it. I think they'll be fair to you. To the police, the implications was clear. Scott, too, was avoiding a polygraph not because he thought the police would entrap him, but because he knew that he would fail the exam. The wiretap also captured another telling moment. On January 20th, Scott played back the voicemail message he'd left for Lacey on the cell phone of Christmas Eve, alerting her that he would be arriving home late from the marina. He listened to it twice and then saved it again. Perhaps Scott is keeping his recollection fresh by reviewing his messages. Investigator Jacobson wrote in his report. That weekend, Scott learned that the police had contacted Amber and were requesting that she submit a polygraph. When do you plan to take the polygraph with me? Amber asked Scott during a phone conversation. Scott said that he still intended to take the test, but it would be a clean test from a private company because police polygraphs are dirty. In the subsequent conversation, Scott told Amber that he had been sick to his stomach after this call. She shouldn't have anything to do for Al. She shouldn't have to do anything for Al Brocchini, he raged. He's disgusting. He shouldn't even set eyes on you. Scott was also upset because he felt that Amber didn't trust him and that she believed that he was involved in Lacey's disappearance. Amber said that she had heard things on the news. What, all the other people I've killed? Scott groused. Interestingly, during the investigation, the Modesto police were contacted by detectives in San Luis Obispo, investigating the disappearance of one of Scott's fellow Cal Poly students, a woman named Kristen Smart. A 6'1" woman, blonde, Smart was last seen on May 24, 1996, in the company of a male student at the college. When they realized that Scott had been attending Cal Poly at the time, The police investigated the possibility that Scott might have been linked to the 19-year-old's disappearance. Speculation about a possible connection was also being discussed in the media. I was surprised to learn later that the members of Scott's own family were privately wondering the same thing. Amber said that she didn't believe those stories, but she did find it interesting. Oh no, what's happening? She did find it interesting that Scott's had a life insurance policy on Lacey. Sorry, I don't know. I got airport things going on. Gotta make sure I'm ready. Amber said she didn't believe those stories, but she did find it interesting that Scott had a life insurance policy on Lacey. She also asked him why Scott's dad was still denying their affair and telling the press that the pictures of Amber and Scott did not prove anything. Scott said he didn't know, but he advised Amber that he was just down the street from her and that he shouldn't be driving much further that evening. Amber invited Scott to her home. "What was that?" Scott asked. Amber didn't repeat the offer. Scott sounded as though he was crying. To the police, the emotion seemed to be forced. "Is it because of me that you are crying?" Amber asked. "It's just because of what's happening to you," Scott told her. In a very obvious manner, Scott wants Amber to invite him over to her place, Jacobson wrote in his summary of the conversation. A very unorthodox move for a grieving husband who has been denying that he has a girlfriend. Not hearing the offer, Scott begins to act as if he's choked up and won't be able to drive much further. Amber asks Scott to call her when he finds a place to sleep. It's not what Scott wants, so he begins to cry a little louder, telling her that how much he cares for her and that he won't be able to think about her once he finds a hotel. Amber doesn't offer her place a second time, and Scott terminates the call. Immediately after hanging up, Scott checks his voicemail. While listening to his voicemail messages lasting 52 seconds, Scott is never once choked up, blowing his nose, coughing, crying, or making any other sound effects that would indicate that he was so severely upset that he couldn't continue to drive. To Jacobson, this was yet another obvious deception, in an attempt, I believe, geared at getting Amber to let him come over, he noted. This once again goes to show the character of Scott Peterson and the real reason he chooses not to take the polygraph test or cooperate with law enforcement. When Scott called Amber the following day, January 20th, she told him that the National Enquirer had been asking questions. "God damn it," Scott replied. "It's my fault. I'm sorry, baby." Amber admitted that she had given police the photos of the two of them together. Scott told her that the Enquirer had hired a private investigator because they tried to hire his own private investigator. "I see you're back to wearing your wedding ring," Amber noted. After a long pause, Scott agreed. When Amber told him that she understood because he was in the public eye, Scott changed the subject, stating that he feels sick. Amber pressed Scott about the promise he'd made to her several days after Christmas, that the two of them could soon start planning a future together. "Okay," Scott said, pausing for what seemed like a long time. He then added that they couldn't talk with each other until the case with Lacey was resolved. He also told her that he had spent the night at a motel in Merced, where he had learned that his home had been burglarized. In fact, he had driven home that evening and discovered it on his own. Another telling came from Kim McGregor, who phoned Scott after telling taking the polygraph to tell him it was easy. The polygrapher had asked her to find out why Scott hadn't taken one, she said. "Well, good, you sound relieved," he replied. He then told McGregor that he hadn't actually been asked to take the test. Kim said that she asked whether she'd known the Petersons before Lacey's disappearance. She was surprised that her denial registered as inconclusive, since she really didn't know them before that time. The police noted Scott didn't sound at all concerned when McGregor told him her test had come back as inconclusive. It was obvious he didn't suspect her. That evening, about 11 p.m., Scott called his parents in San Diego. His father answered the phone. After some talk about Scott's lawyer, Kirk McAllister, their conversation moved on to the break-in at Scott's house. "They smashed up my French doors pretty good," Scott said. "I had to get them repaired." Even though Kim McGregor had already confessed to him, Scott told Lee that he thought that Lacey's father, Dennis Rocha, Happy Thanksgiving.
Same with you.
He thought that Lacey's father, Dennis Rocha, might have done it while on a drunken binge. He also speculated that Brett might have helped. When Scott wondered if Ron Gratzky could be involved behind it, Lee said that he was betting on it. He asked if Scott had given the police the three men's name. Scott said that he had. "I gave Dennis's name and number to one suspect," he added. At one point, Jackie Peterson joined the conversation. "I know it was one of those guys, Ron, Brett, or Dennis," Scott told his mother. "It was probably Dennis." Jackie said that she didn't think that Ron was involved. He had called Lee that afternoon to express the hope that the two men could still go fishing together. "This guy is a snake," Scott replied, adding that Ron didn't have a good past. "Oh, I love it when the pot calls the kettle black," Jackie said ruefully. There were more enlightening interviews in the days to come. Detective Bueller tracked down David Fernandez, who also dined with Scott and Sean Sibley at the conference in Anaheim that past October. David had originally intended to introduce his friend Eric to Sean, but he soon learned that Sean was engaged. David said that Scott Peterson didn't seem to be deterred by Sean's engagement. He assumed Scott wasn't married because of the way he was hitting on Sean. According to him, Scott made suggestive comments throughout the evening and at one point asked Sean about her favorite sexual position. Scott pressed her for about why she hadn't picked out a wedding date and asked whether she was really happy in the relationship. David said that Eric Olson was turned off by the conversation and left right after the meal. Scott boasted during the dinner about having a lot of money and a high salary. He took the group that owned the two homes, one in Modesto and the other in Southern California. These stories also used with Amber, suggested Scott's clear need to elevate himself in the eyes of others, particularly women. The investigators were also asking friends and family to review the events since December 24th with fresh eyes. Were there any incidents or conversations that might have been unimportant but might have had a different significance now that they knew more about Amber Frey? Sharon Moshe described a conversation she had with Scott about a week after Lacey went missing. Although her son-in-law was vague about the details, when he came home on Christmas Eve morning, he told Sharon that Lacey was sitting in a little chair, combing her hair in a style that her sister Amy had taught her on the previous evening. Scott had never mentioned this detail to the police. Sharon also told the police that she was taken aback when she learned that Scott continued working out and golfing at the Del Rio Country Club after Lacey went missing. She was having trouble eating and sleeping and could barely imagine a moment of relaxation or leisure while her daughter's fate remained uncertain. In mid-January, Sharon and Ron had invited Scott over for dinner. Although he arrived late, he seemed to be in a good mood. Scott told the group that someone had asked him earlier that day how he was doing, and he said, "Fine." "That's the first time I've said that," he added. During the meal, Scott prattled on about computer problems he was having, but he barely mentioned Lacey. At one point, Sharon told him she'd been watching coverage of the case on Fox News Channel. A fisherman being interviewed about Scott's alibi mentioned that shrimp was an appropriate bait for sturgeon fishing in the bay. Scott just shrugged his shoulders and grinned. Sharon told Grogan that she tried to dismiss Scott's behavior because she realized that if Scott was responsible, Lacey would not likely be coming home. Brent Moshe and his wife Rose recalled that several years earlier, after the funeral for Lacey's grandmother, the family gathered to talk. At one point, Rose, Scott, and Lacey began discussing their childhood. Rose was taken aback when Scott suddenly burst out crying. From one outburst, he seemed as though his childhood had been an unhappy one. She later told Brent that she found Scott's display of emotion out of character, considering he's usually reserved, calm demeanor. Scott's flowing tears suggested to Rose that Scott had not come from a loving family. Brett also described an early visit with Scott on December 25, 2002. He arrived at home at around 7 a.m. to find Scott still wet from the shower and wrapped in a towel. While Brett waited, Scott went into the bedroom to dress. When he emerged, he told Brett that he had a bad night. I was very angry, but anger came out. Scott did not elaborate, but Brett didn't press him further. Brett was frustrated when Scott ignored his repeated request to check Lacey's clothing. Brett wanted to see if any of the items were missing. I kept asking him and he wouldn't do it, Brett told Grogan. Scott seems uninterested in doing what he can to assist. Sharon showed up at the house soon after Brett. Scott and Sharon spoke briefly with the neighbor, and then Scott announced that he was going to the warehouse to retrieve some tape so that he could start hanging missing person flyers. He left around 8:45 a.m., and for the next several hours, his whereabouts were unknown. I believe that Scott must have used this time to move things around from the night before. We know he returned to the warehouse at some time that morning because the jacket and the lures were turned up in the boat. We know the tarp and umbrellas were moved into the backyard. We may never know whether he used this time to dispose of other incriminating items. Detective Grogan also reached out to Scott's half-brother, Mark Peterson. He learned that the Peterson clan wasn't as close-knit as Jackie and Lee had claimed. This was no Brady Bunch story, as the Petersons had been telling the reporters. As sales representative for the packaging company, Mark Peterson had been estranged from the family for nearly 13 years. A disagreement with his father and his brother Joe over the family business had placed an untenable strain on the father-son relationship. Mark said that he and his father had barely spoken since falling out, that is, until Lacey went missing. Mark had met Lacey only 3 times, once before her marriage to Scott, again at their wedding, and then once again at Thanksgiving that past November. His sister Susan Cudillo had hosted that gathering, and Mark and his family had attended. It was the first time in years everyone was together for the holidays. Mark acknowledged that he and Lee were still on the outs when he accepted the invitation. However, Susan was anxious to show off her new house, and his wife wanted to maintain a relationship with his children's grandfather, so Mark agreed to go. He was also excited by the news that Scott and Lacey were expecting a baby. The only thing I really remember is that Lacey was pregnant, just kind of tired and a little uncomfortable, Mark recalled. I remember her being a little bit on the quiet side that evening, but there was, a house full of people, so I don't think I had much of a conversation with her that night. The next contact Mark had with his family was on Christmas morning, when he was advised that Lacey was missing. Well, I'm I'm a little curious about the family dynamics, and I know that Scott was obviously the youngest child, Grogan said. Jackie had children from another relationship, right? Through my sister, I did hear that a man and a woman approached Jackie and said, "We're your children that you adopted out," Mark said, referring to Don Chaplin and Ann Bird. Since then, I think that Jackie has tried to kind of stay in touch with them. I don't know any specifics about her past, he explained. In response to questions, Mark admitted that he had actually known very little about Scott or about the Peterson family dynamics. He and his siblings, Joe and Susan, lived with their mother growing up and only visited their dad on weekends. There was a 10-year age difference between Mark and Scott, and the two spent very little time together as kids. We always lived in the same town, and we lived in San Diego, and we would probably see Scott on the weekends, that kind of thing, Mark explained. As a child, what was Scott like? Grogan asked. Well, I was a child when Scott was a child, so I don't know what he was like. I mean, he was a normal kid. Lee and Jackie seemed kind of protective of him, Grogan said. Do you know why that is? I think my dad does because essentially Scott, I think, raised him pretty much like an only child, really. They did everything together. Scott came along at a time in my dad's life when Scott was probably, when he got to that kind of really fun age, like 8 or 10 years old, my dad was doing okay financially then. And I think he was able to kind of spend a lot of time with Scott. I mean, if we traveled, they took Scott with them kind of thing. During the conversation, Grogan tried to establish who in the family had been closest to Scott. Jackie's third child, John, had come to live with the family when Lee and Jackie married, and he and Scott had grown up together. John went by the last name Peterson, yet Mark wasn't sure whether Lee had actually adopted him. Mark believed that John was about 5 years older than Scott, but had no information about how to reach him. Grogan was particularly curious about Lee and Jackie's overprotective ways of Scott. The detective explained how they had tried to stop him from questioning Scott at headquarters on Christmas Day. They came over to the station here, and I was talking to Scott, and wanted to pull him out of an interview and didn't want him talking to me without an attorney, and didn't want him taking the polygraph test, and it seemed unusual for the amount of concern there. Do you have any idea why that is? Grogan inquired. Well, I can't get into my dad's head, Mark responded. But we had this case a few years ago. He described the murder of Stephanie Crow, which occurred just inside San Diego. The case was thrown out because the judge, in fact, said you guys, the police, coerced this child basically to confessing, Mark said. And there was a TV movie about it, and I'm sure Dad watched it. You watch that a week before your own son is being interrogated. I think there's a tendency there. The TV movie Mark was referring to was the interrogation of Michael Crow, a special presentation on my network, Court TV. Court TV was instrumental in obtaining and airing the interrogation video, which led to the suppression of Michael's confession. Some years later, a drifter, Richard Tuite, was tried and convicted of Stephanie's murder. Okay, so you don't think there's any difference there, Grogan pressed. I mean, what I'm struck by is I don't know theories. He changed course. Not too long ago, they gave him $20,000 for a membership to a golf club. Lee and Jackie did? Well, it just seems to me that they're very protective of him, Grogan said, like he's able to get whatever he needs from them. Grogan thought that Peterson seemed to do a little bit more than helping him along, for like a normal 30-year-old guy might expect from his parents. So I was just kind of curious if there was, something that happened to Scott previously, or if there was some reason that was going on. Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't help you with that, Mark advised. I don't think there was anything where they feel like they owe him anything. I mean, he grew up in more of a privileged background, upbringing than my other siblings did. He grew up basically in the nicest neighborhood in San Diego County, and it's probably one of the nicer neighborhoods in the whole country. I think he was just kind of their little, baby, and like I said, he was kind of raised as an only child, but I'll tell you, I'm really surprised that they would give up that amount of money to him for a country club membership. I never really thought they gave him anything. I always thought they were proud of the way Scott went out and worked while he was going to school at Cal Poly, but was able to start a restaurant on his own and was able to get an education to find a job in Modesto, Mark continued. They thought of their son as someone who went out and made his own life. I was under the impression that they were extremely proud of the way Scott was able to get these things done on his own. So when you say they gave him money for a golf club membership, I'm kind of really surprised by that. As far as any violence with Scott, Grogan said, any violent acts that you're aware as a juvenile or anything? No, absolutely not. I mean, not even as a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. I never saw him lose his temper, Mark said. Not even as a child? No. As the conversation drew to a close, Grogan asked Mark if he had any questions for the police. Well, I am curious about reports on Scott's finances. I hear reports of bankruptcy and heavy debt. Right now, it looks like he's having some financial problems, Grogan said. And it doesn't look like the business was doing very well. And then personal debt, what do we have shows that he is quite a bit in debt. Yeah, Mark seemed to be digesting the information he was now gleaning from the detective. The picture the officer was painting was quite different than what had been led to believe by family members. I guess our concern, the Peterson family concern, is that with all this heavy focus on Scott, that other leads might be put on a back burner. Grogan explained that police were working all leads, but had been unable to eliminate Scott as a suspect. With the simple fact that Scott taking a lie detector test and passing, would that be enough? I don't want to say clear because I know there's some margin of error, but there is too much evidence for even a lie detector test passing on Scott's part to clear his name, Mark had asked. Right, Grogan replied. Scott has chosen his path and declined to take it. I guess I've been wondering if Scott has just been taking this test and passed it, it wouldn't have, because I'm real troubled by this, I just don't see his personality as one who could perpetrate this kind of thing, planned, especially for monetary gain. Yeah, Grogan commented. I guess I was looking for a little bit of more of ammunition to go to my family and say, you know what, if he would just do this, it might help things along, but I'm not sure that's what would happen anyways. Well, it certainly would not hurt his position, Grogan said. In late January, an agent from the FBI interviewed Timothy Kalki, a childhood neighbor of Scott and the Peterson family. From the time he was about 5 years old until they moved away 4 years later, Kalki had lived across the street from the Petersons. He told the investigator that he remembered Scott's older brother John as a troubled child and recounted several minor incidents of violence and mischief that he believed may have been involved with John. But there was no proof linking John to these events. More to the point, as the FBI noted, Kalki couldn't provide any information on Scott. Because Scott was 3 years older at the time, Kalki couldn't remember much about him. In the coming days, the police learned that Scott was meeting with friends to discuss the sale of his home and was looking to purchase a new vehicle. From the wiretap on his phone, police found out about meeting between Scott and two real estate agents, Brian Ulrich and Brian Ergin. I want to keep this quiet, obviously, Scott told Ergin in one call. Even if Lacey comes back, we will not want to live here either way, however this comes out. How do you want to look at it doing it? I'd like to put it on the market right now, Scott said. Make sure you keep it quiet. Can I sell it furnished? Yeah, you can. The police dispatched an officer wearing a wire to the Apetiz restaurant, recorded the conversation, but very little of it was caught on tape. Police also learned that Scott had been phoning around to local car dealerships, wanting to sell Lacey's Land Rover and to buy a new truck. Investigators also learned that Scott was planning to travel to Southern California to appear on Good Morning America. The show's producers offered to pick him up by limousine, transport him to an airport, and then to return him home the following day. Phone records also showed that Scott was planning to spend some time at his half-sister's house in Berkeley, California. Ann Bird called Scott early in the evening of January 22nd to talk about Scott's upcoming stay. She and her husband Tim were departing for Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, on a pleasure trip and offered Scott the use of their home while they were away. I'll leave the key under the mat, Ann said, and then gave Scott the address. The house is very distinctive. We just removed a shrub from the front yard. Investigators listened in on the call and observed Scott was giggling and sounded very upbeat while speaking to his sister. I will leave Tim's golf clubs for your protection, Ann joked. Ha ha ha, Scott replied. I just hope that everything just somehow has a miracle ending. Yeah, I know it will. I mean, everything is so shitty has happened that something really good must be around the corner. That's what I'm figuring. Ann told Scott that she and Tim would be returning on February 2nd, and he was welcome to stay as long as he'd like. Have you been sleeping okay, she said. I am up to about 3 hours right now, midnight to 3 a.m., Scott replied. That's better. Murder, She Wrote is on at 3 a.m., Scott laughed. Ah, not the choice for me. I know that is probably not good for you to watch her, Ann told Scott, and that she would love to take her brother to Puerto Vallarta with them someday. Hopefully we'll be going with Lacey and your new little guy. I am really hopeful and feel strongly that she's being held somewhere. Yeah, she'll be back, Scott said. Keep your chin up. The police used their wiretaps to keep tabs on Scott while they continued to search for Lacey's body. They found a title expert to review the internet sites Scott had visited on his computer, which mapped out an area near the Berkeley Marina. Grogan also ordered a sonar scan of portions of the San Francisco Bay. The detective believed that there was a very strong likelihood that Lacey's body was in the bay. After a careful study of the computer sites, the experts advised Grogan that depending on the amount of weight and the water current situation, it is possible that Lacey's body had been swept out of the bay, where it might never be retrieved. Happy Thanksgiving.